spiel. And now we get to the real business of the afternoon. And I can introduce our speaker. And here he is, Daniel O'Connor. So his debut novel, Nothing, was published this June by Weidenfeld Nicolson. Daniel is the Colm Tobin Lecturer in Creative Writing at the University of Liverpool, where he also works on 20th century and contemporary literature, writing on figures such as Ted Hughes, Seamus Heaney, and James Joyce, and others. Through no small misfortune, Daniel was born in Middlesbrough, and Middlesbrough will form the backdrop of his next novel, which he is currently in the process of writing. So, and now, Daniel, I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dinah. And thanks for having us. So I'm going to start by reading the first chapter of Nothing, which has a little bit of fruity language, so if there's any children around, you might want to cover their ears. It needs an introduction because it's the start as well, which is the nice thing about reading from the start. So I'll take it away. For 6 weeks, Michael had no shadow, hiding from the white hospital light. He can still hear you, the nurses would say. To Esme and the kids, it must have felt as if they were talking down a well. Daddy's in a very, very deep sleep, she said. At first, the kids needed coaxing to sit by his side. They couldn't get their heads around that thing lying there, but she made it into a game. Daddy was asleep, and they were trying to make him dream about it that day. Louis, tell Daddy what he did at school. Mara, tell Daddy what you did at nursery. Louis's reader was finally coming along, but he still got stuck on certain words like pale and tumbling. Mara could imagine a coin falling down a well and never stopping, not even when it reached the bottom. And in the evening, Esme lifted her heavy head and went sloshing down the corridor to the toilet, where sometimes she would pee instead of cry. She leaned over the edge of his bed. Louis had exhausted all of the colouring books in the hospital and was drawing pictures of polar bears for a school project, filling them in with white pencil on white paper. Isn't he a good little boy, the nurses would say, staying so well inside the lines? Mara always hid behind the chair, giggling while Louis counted. Ready or not, here I come. Sometimes he bored of finding her behind the chair and played his computer games while she hid, crashing their toy cars into each other until Auntie Alex found a pair of them. Which of my favourite people want cake and bath time, she asked. Me, said Esme. At first, she'd insisted on being the one to wash her husband. Once, she came back from the shop to find that a nurse was halfway through, and she asked him who the hell he thought he was. The next time, she made sure she wasn't around and tried to smile apologetically whenever she saw one of the nurses. The hospital was already responsible for his insides. She conceded to them his skin. Initially, it was immaculate, the way the electric doors slid shut against the diseased world. Then Esme began to notice frayed edges on the curtains, wheelchair frames taped together, toilet lights that flickered briefly. Every other day, they would change the sheets. They were bridesmaids to Sleeping Beauty, all white and fold in delicacy. Sometimes she'd watch because it made her husband seem precious. Sometimes she'd leave because it seemed like preparations for a funeral. What do you think he's dreaming of, his mum would ask. I bet it's you, her mum would say to Esme, rubbing her shoulders, kissing her cheek. Michael's mum looked disappointed. Esme's mum, who'd come all the way from the other end of the country, wondered aloud if there was anything on telly. Esme liked to think of him as basking, as if he would wake up livelier than ever, but being so still is enervating. There are marathons of exhaustion that come with quietly fearing the worst. She kept having this dream. Was it a memory? The lines blur with time, where she was supposed to meet him in the pub. There was a match on, and you had to squirm through sweaty bodies to the bar. It'd been half an hour now, and he was nowhere to be seen. She kept messaging him, not upstairs, not down here, nowhere. This place, so thick with people, felt utterly, nauseously empty. She'd wake up panicking, relieved to find him here in the hospital bed. A lot of the times, The machines would be her only company. But there were also occasional nurses, doctors. His parents would come for a few hours, her sister, evenings with some friends, Lucas, who came to read aloud the books he'd always pestered Michael to read, the call centre voices of the mortgage department, who also sounded trapped. Most of the day was spent in the chair beside his bed, fearing. She moisturised his hands obsessively, held them, saying, "It's later than you think," to herself, to the room, but not to him. In the hours away from work and weather, from outside shifts and mutabilities, with only the measured, stabilised body of her husband for company, the past ate patches into her days. It was probably the longest she had thought about herself since she was a teenager. Those interminable summers of clothes and music and boys and tanning and keeping a diary and sometimes getting so drunk she'd fold into bed on 40 hands and feet and wake up furry, caterpillared. All those fantasies that fluttered into her bedroom curtains, into her pillows, of boyfriends that needed whole oceans of care, of boyfriends in comas. She would have been so jealous of herself. His mum started wearing a crucifix again, not that she believed in it. Sometimes Esme would catch her murmuring at his bedside as though she was praying. His mum was proud of herself for more or less holding it together. "Oh, Michael," she mumbled, rubbing his hand. "Not again," as though he'd made a bad habit of comas. But you can't control what the dead inhabit, or how. So Esme asked if she wanted anything from the shop by the entrance. She was going to see if they had a copy of Gardener's World, or fuck it, take a break. Because there's only so long you can read novels about the costs of marital strife alongside the sad tide of your comatose husband. But sometimes she could be practical too, his mum. "Well," she said, "at least they won't sack him now," said Esme. "Well, it doesn't look good, does it, sacking someone when they can't even hear you?" "Redundant," his dad said, touching her hand. "Exactly." The sandwiches generally tasted of much, but her apple was nice and shiny, only a small dent on the surface. But when she bit into it, the bruise was deep and manky. Seeing her crying, Louis came over his open bag. "Do you want a crisp, Mummy?" She let it melt into her mouth, trying not to cry anymore. "Daddy's counted a gazillion sheep," Mara announced, whenever a new doctor or nurse entered. It was part of Auntie Alex's attempt at explaining things. "No, Daddy's just counting sheep, their woolen tails and woolen bellies. The kids are allowed to stay there with Mummy on weekends, but most school nights, Alex would take them home for bath times and stories and a game of Daddy Sleeps, where they would be as still as possible for as long as they could, and the first one to move lost and had to be a dog or a horse or a rat. And even though Alex thought it was a bit morbid, she didn't know how to stop it. One night, Esme completely fucking lost it and deleted everything on her phone. Photos, apps, accounts, anything that so much as mentioned him. He used his thumb to open his phone and did the same. It was exhilarating. A total emptiness, a complete evisceration, the whole lot cut out, gouged clear, down to the simplicity of a white room, of her, of him. She caught up with the detective saw she'd missed because she was crying in the toilet. She took a new picture of him between bites of her Twix, deleted it, took it again. He lay there, the bastard, without a care in the world. Esme tried hating the chairs, the plastic curtains, the spit floating in swimming pool effect of the floor tiles. But chairs and curtains and tiles don't hurt. She hated the nurses, hated the doctors. Her spite was smothered by care, by patience. So she tried hating him. He was a bastard, after all, leaving her to cope with 2 kids and a husband in a coma. This was fun. She could sit there and saying, "Wake up, dickhead. What, are you just going to lie there all day, you lazy little shit? I'm leaving you for a doctor, or fuck it, the next man that stands up, you horizontal twat." She'd say it quietly enough that no one in the corridor heard, but loud enough to feel it. She could hope his balls turned to granite, that his United would stay trapped in lower league promotion battles, or even better, that he'd wake up and be absolutely fine, except for something innocuously embarrassing, like a lazy eye, mispronouncing things, that he'd forget how to tie his laces. He'd catch her laughing. She'd desperately want to tell him the curse she'd put on him, that he'd never be able to find shoes that fit and he'd go around wincing forever on his corns and everyone would think he had piles. And she tried this, squeezing his hand, shaking his arm a little, saying, "I've given you corns, you prick," saying it right in his ear. Because what if he laughed? What if he just sat up and laughed? Once, just once, Michael's dad sighed aloud, thinking of his own dad. The dead go off like a grenade and leave behind a deafness that rings out in the ears. But his dad had come back from the war, and if you ever pulled a pin out of his Sunday afternoon naps, the whole house came down. I hate watching people sleep, he said. His mum rolled her eyes, as if to say, "You'll complain about anything." His dad shivered. "That's someone walking over your grave, that is," said his mum, then sloped off to the shop, after looking at his son as though the button was broken and you couldn't change the channel. At night, the place was lit up in blue dark lights like an aquarium, and walking past the wards for a chocolate bar or a turn, you could feel the heaviness of all those bodies floating there. Esme worried about blackouts, failed generators, kept on at Alex whenever she offered to bring clean things, to bring candles. Esme was no longer wearing her best pajamas. Lucas stopped bringing things to read to him. He'd shout through the house, said Michael's mum, "I'm going to Luke's," and then he'd come back all covered in muck. Luke didn't know if he was supposed to apologise. He tried reminding Michael of when they were boys, jump in the ditch. Michael didn't make it. Constructing a time machine out of a cardboard box and a potato clock. Neither of them made it. Of all the times that Michael had had enough of him and locked himself in the bathroom while Luke sat against the door in his friend's house trying to coax him out. When Esme closed her eyes, their voices sounded almost the same. After a few weeks, he came to stare and to talk to her. They sat next to each other, either side of Michael, just like old times, he said. She laughed. She imagined him in bed. Mara sat on his knee, and Esme bit her lip, blinked, weightily. He always brought her coffee, played with the kids. "What are you going to do?" he asked once. She half smiled at him, as if he might already know, or almost know. He felt guilty for asking. Sometimes, with everyone gone, she'd climb up on the bed and lie beside him, her old earphones strung between them, listening to songs they listened to when they were young, and learning to lean quietly against each other on coaches, on trains, in a lovely slowness against the pacing world, the split music meeting in their heads. But lying there, all those wires, like that, was uncomfortable. She couldn't take it for long. Over the top of the magazine, she bought it even though it had a disappointing picture of a black hole in the front, because it felt real, or more real than reading news on a phone. It looked a bit like a mannequin. Him. You could almost mistake it for a man who tried to take her for a romantic walk along the beach. The man she soaked, kicking up the sea at him. God, she felt like such a knob. The man who arranged classical fancy dress party for her birthday because he knew she liked ancient things in fancy dress, fashioned her as Helen, and instead of coming as Paris or Achilles or Hector, made himself into a giant horse, got stuck in the bathroom and had to be freed by 2 legionnaires and the Minotaur. The man who rubbed her back and kissed her neck and who was nearly there in bed, he almost looked real. But she'd been thinking about emailing work about the Vedas exhibition budget stuff. She'd have to see if they had anything. She'd get Leah for work for her birthday in the garage over the road. Vogue, Red Bull, a warning triangle and a high-vis vest. It caught her for a second, looking at this thing under the blanket with its eerie gasps, its wires, its bagged liquids, her husband's lifeless face. What if it woke up?
Thank you, Danny. That was great. It really was. Now, we're going to talk this afternoon about the joys and challenges of publishing a first novel. But before we do that, it's too good an opportunity to miss just to talk a little bit about the novel itself, because it is the most extraordinary and, I think, wonderful book. So I want to begin, Danny, by asking you about a really distinctive quality in the book, and that is the juxtaposition of the domestic, the mundane, with something other than that. And no spoilers here, but I don't think it's giving too much away to say that Michael does find himself encountering something very different from the domestic, the ordinary, the everyday. So was that there from the initial concept of the novel, or did it develop and evolve as the writing process went on?
Yeah, it gets a bit weird, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
I think so. The initial idea came to me in a really sort of innocuous and stupid way. I was just at work one day, and someone was trying to remind me of someone else that we knew, and I couldn't quite remember who it was. He was like, "Oh, he's got the beard. It's this guy with a beard." And then suddenly he just appeared behind him, walked up the stairs, as if my colleague had imagined him into being. I thought that was quite funny. But I thought, wouldn't it have been funnier if the guy with the beard was just somewhere completely different, and he imagines his beard, and the beard just disappears? I thought, oh, walking around and your beard's gone suddenly. I thought, oh, there's some mileage in that. And it was that idea of erasing things that really gripped me in the first place, that sort of sense of, okay, well, that's slightly unusual. And I can remember exactly what day it was as well, because it was the day that Donald Trump was elected president. And that seemed unimaginable, didn't it? And it's always like, I think, I've had, maybe other people have this as well, but I've always had this slight superstition, particularly with writing something, that if you imagine the worst, or if you write the worst by virtue of having done it, then it won't happen, because we have that sort of thing, okay, well, like things that you can write don't happen because life just doesn't work like that. So it's that sort of superstition that I was interested around in the first place. And then, as I said, I thought there was some mileage in that. I thought you could possibly make a story out of that. I thought the idea stuck with me, and it stayed with me for long enough to start adding other things to it and thinking about how that might evolve, how that might affect domestic relationships, how that might change a person, how that might change the way other people related to that person. And obviously, there's a lot of different ways that can evolve in literary terms, and a lot of different frames of reference to it. And the one thing that I was specifically trying to avoid, not because I have any sort of bad feelings towards this, but is like the Jose Saramago thing, where it expands into being this huge national emergency. Yeah. Like, I didn't want this thing to happen where this man has an accident, he goes into a coma, and then wakes up and starts thinking these strange things, and suddenly MI5 are helicoptering down, and like everything has to be resolved, and politicians get involved. I just, like, it felt like that it would become ridiculous too quickly, and it wasn't something that I felt that I could handle, that I was equipped to handle. But I thought, you know what I can do? I can stick some people in a house and make it really sad and grim for them in a house. So there was something about that sort of being, the enclosed space, the domesticity was really important, just as the engine of the plot. Because if you trap people, then it's much harder for them, obviously, to get out of a situation. Like, if you trap them emotionally, if you trap them physically in this place as well. So most of the thing really became an exercise then in, well, how can I trap them a bit more? Like, how can I make this a bit more domestic? How can I keep it as domestic as possible? And in some ways, it stopped being a book about mad stuff happening to someone, and it became a book about a marriage and kids instead, which wasn't anything that I expected. So that was a surprise to me in many ways.
Yeah.
But
so the book is called Nothing, and that concept of nothingness, the idea of nothing, is, I think, so intriguing as that domestic framework, and together with what you just called the mad stuff, because it does indeed get a bit weird in, I think, really compelling ways. But say a little bit more for us, if you will, about that notion of nothing and nothingness, and how that feeds in to the way in which the narrative develops. Quite a challenging thing to do.
Without giving anything away as well.
Yes, indeed.
I'm going to make it hard for
you're not here to have any more.
Again, like, so the idea of nothingness wasn't anything that I set out to write. I didn't set myself a challenge, the challenge of writing a book about nothing, which is an interesting challenge. But yeah, it wasn't the one that I had. And it sort of crept in. I suppose it was a consequence of what happens with. I'm not going to give too much away if I say that what happens to Michael is that he wakes up from his coma, and he starts to think that he can imagine things out of existence. So obviously, if someone's imagining things out of existence, I've got to deal with this idea of nothingness being at the centre of it. And I think it would have been quite easy just to obliterate everything and have everything just disappear, and that's final. But there was something that sort of frustrated me about that. I think what I was particularly interested in exploring is the ways in which nothingness is more often than not frustrated. Like one of the things that kept coming back to me that maybe it doesn't even make it into the novel anyway, but it's that thing about energy in a vacuum. You know, so if you have a vacuum, it is never completely a vacuum, and energy just suddenly appears but then disappears, and it has that balance. There's something really striking about that. I think that even in these places that we think of as like being the totality of nothing, there is always something there. There's always something underscoring that nothingness. And then I suppose it got connected to all those other things I was thinking about: the domesticity, the marital relationships, and like what does it mean to know someone? What does it mean when someone disappears? What does it mean when people remember things in different ways? And one of the things that I was particularly interested in is this idea that like we are never nothing. We will never possibly be nothing, because there's always something of us that survives somewhere, particularly like close to our lives in other people. Like other people constitute our lives for us. They think things about us that we don't recognise, but that's as much of us as the things that we think belong to us. So we are constructed by all of these other people simultaneously. Like for instance, there's all of these people looking at us in this room. They're all looking at us from different perspectives. We are alive in all of these different heads in different ways. So even if I was to suddenly disappear now, like there would still be something of me that survives in different ways. So there's that sort of nothingness that I was particularly interested in, but also in the sense that it's only by having something in the first place that we have this terror of nothing, like this terror of not being. So it's a very easy concept to flip in that way. That you go, okay, well, I'm terrified of not being here, but the only reason that we can have that sort of terror, that sort of fear, is because we are here. That nothingness in that way is always about something. Like it can never be just this pure concept of nothingness, because there is something.
And again, without giving too much away, we're being very careful here. I think those ideas really do feed into the form of the novel, the structure, the tone, the narrative perspective. And thinking now perhaps just a little bit more about the process of writing that first novel, with those ideas swirling around in your head. How do you put the story together, which you do, out of those elements? You had set yourself a real challenge, which I do think you absolutely bring off, but there's no doubt that it is a real challenge. Was that something that grew under your hand, or did you really sit down and think, right, I'm going to do it like this, and then follow it through?
Definitely the former. So I mean, so for instance, to go back to your question about nothingness, that was never something that was. I was never sitting there thinking, as I said, I'm going to write about a book about nothing. It was always, it sort of evolved slowly, and I think for me, this is different for other people. I'm certain it is, but for me, it was always the case of like I sort of just follow my nose or follow my ear a little bit, and then it's only when I step back later on that I realise, okay, well, there's other stuff here that I might be able to do something with. So yeah, I think the tone was always the first bit. I made like 3 or 4 different stabs at doing this over maybe like 6 or 8 months, where I'd spend a week on it or maybe a fortnight on it, and I'd have a go. I was like, I had that story, that idea was quite a good idea. I'll stick with it, and I'll give it a stab. And the tone just wouldn't be right. The person might not be right. The structure of the sentences might not be right. It might just be, this didn't feel quite settled, whatever it was. And I remember quite distinctly, actually, I was on a train journey back to London from Liverpool, and I was just sitting and writing on the train, because what else are you doing on a train apart from just fear terribly about things? I remember getting it quite right, and I think, okay, yeah, I settled on this tone. I think the thing about the tone was this sort of this slight distance, this wryness, this sense of being a little bit removed from the action. There's like a tiny bit of irony in there as well, but also an irony balanced by sincerity as well. I think that was the thing that I was struggling to find. And once I'd got the tone, then the rest of it sort of followed from that. So it was the tone that was really leading the story, because I had no idea what was going to happen in this thing. Like honestly couldn't work out how I was going to get to the end of it. Because I was like, oh, it's an idea, but it's nothing else. Like, there's no obvious story there, there's no obvious characters, there's nothing else. So it was really the tone that built all of it. So from that tone, I sort of get this man in Michael who's like slightly disenfranchised, but not so disenfranchised that he's despairing, just sort of disenfranchised, saying, that was a bit crap, but I'm not going to do anything about it. And that built everything from there.
I think that point about tone and that being the first decision that you made is fascinating. And from that, as I imagine, would flow other technical processes. So given the tone that the novel has, it couldn't have been a first-person narrative.
No.
That was a reflection, that third-person decision was a reflection of the tone that you were building and maintaining. So that must have been there from the start. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I can't recall ever attempting it in the first person.
Yeah. Yeah.
And one of the other things that's quite useful about that structure as well, I mean, so the passage that I just read in the first chapter, the point of view isn't with Michael at all, because obviously, how do you write a first-person narrative where someone's in a coma? People have done it, and people have done it quite well, but it wasn't something I was prepared to attempt. That would be literally pages of nothing, just a man lying there. So I knew that if I wanted to convey that, and I think that was the emotional bit that I'd started with, that was the bit that lured me in, this thing of a man in a hospital bed. I was like, okay, I can connect to that some way emotionally. I needed to have other people, and just by virtue of needing other people, I needed a third-person perspective or other voices in it.
That point about voices that you've just made, I think, is really crucial, because the novel does offer the reader, I think, a very dynamic web of different perspectives through voice and through dialogue and reported speech that I think is really essential to the experience of reading the story that you're unwinding for us. I do think that is, again, a very challenging thing for a novelist, to get those voices right. Was that something that you found that you had to spend a good deal of time and energy to focus on, or did it seem to kind of, again, emerge quite spontaneously, naturally? Thinking now about the process of writing.
I think it depends how cruel you are. I've spent my entire life imitating people. I think that's what it is. But I come from a family, my brother's even better at it. You get to people's voices and mannerisms straight away. There's something of that sort of that Dickensian thing as well. You know, Dickens would spend time in front of the mirror if he was constructing a character. He'd be like contorting himself until he got, it's like, I've got him there. And spend the rest of the day like that. I think there was definitely something in that sense of just, I really just enjoy inhabiting other people's voices. And it's a habit that, as I said, is cruel, but transcends writing. It's something that I just do all the time. Like it's my sense of humour in many ways, which isn't very nice, is it? But that, I think, definitely that sense of, well, you can do nice things as well, can't you? Because not only are you inhabiting other people's voices, but you're also inhabiting their point of view and thinking about how they see the world and thinking about, okay, well, how does the way they see the world also impinge on their voice? So definitely that sense of weaving in and out of people, I think, was something that I really enjoyed about writing it in many ways.
You do the police in different voices. That, I mustn't mislead you, not that the police make any seminal appearance in this novel.
But with better impressions than T.S. Eliot as well, though.
So, turning now then to the way in which you have your narrative, you have your ideas, how then does it become that book sitting on the table? Because that's a different challenge. It's not wholly different, and obviously the sorts of processes that you've been talking about feed in to publication. But it's fraught, is it not, every step of the way?
So I'd love to be able to tell you that I sellotaped loads of bits of paper together and took some amphetamines and wrote it in 24 hours, and it was just published because people thought I was a genius. No, it's
not like that.
Yeah, it's it's a marathon, and it is,
Yeah.
it's, a lot of
Yeah.
it's tedium in many ways, and it's, I
Yeah.
think you have to enjoy just sitting there, messing about with things, and not be precious about it as
Yeah.
well. It's such a huge
Yeah.
part of it. I think it's really easy to get sucked into the trap of thinking that I'm writing this book, it needs to be perfect, I need to have
Yeah.
everything just how I want it. And of course that's just not how it's not how books work, it's also not how the industry works.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the first thing really is just, yeah, it's that thing of sticking with something. I mean, it's such a famous thing, isn't it, about writing a novel, that people get the first 10,000 words and
Yeah.
then collapse at that point. And I think more often than not, the reason people struggle with that is just that sense of, okay, well, it has to be perfect. If you acknowledge that it can be crap and write a finished crap book and then make it better from
Yeah.
there, I think that's generally the best approach. And there are even like just little small technical things that you can do just to get your head over that. So for instance, whenever I write a paragraph that I know is atrocious, I will just highlight it in red as a way of saying, Danny, come back to this. You've made a terrible mistake, but you can fix it later on. It's okay. Or someone else can fix it for you, which is even better. So that's the first bit, and then just getting something finished. But then, so in terms of like the minefield of actually publishing something, for me, I think so. Like I've had a twin education in the sense that I came through the academic route, and so obviously did my undergraduate and then my postgraduate degrees, and that's an amazing training in learning how to read and learning how to think about books in nuanced and intelligent, I think, ways. But for many reasons, I think the best training that I had in terms of the market and publishing and just how people read and why they read was working as a bookseller.
Yeah.
So I worked for years in bookshops, and it's an amazing place to see people who you might later caricature as well.
Yes.
You do get some interesting characters. But just, I think you have some lovely conversations where people come in looking for this book. I like these kind of books. What else might I read? What could I look for? Like, you learn so much about how people read and why people read. I think it's really important for that. You also learn how to sell a book in a sentence, which is a really useful skill for then when you go to industrial figures, when you go into agents, and when you go to publishers. The ability to do that is vital. It's not only that, but then also that thing of recognizing where something might fit in the market. So I think working in bookshops also made me a much better reader. Because it would have been very easy for me to sit as an academic just looking at my stuff, which would be like mid-20th century poetry mostly, which isn't going to get me a novel published. It's like, oh yeah, I like Ted Hughes. Well, he's dead. So, you know, got a bit of a problem there. There's nothing new coming out. So just knowing where you might fit in and knowing how you might fit in is so vital for when you come then to have those conversations with agents, even just approaching agents in the first place. Because when you're writing a letter to an agent, the standard script of that letter is, hi, I really like your list. Like, I like the people you represent. And you have to be able to explain why you like those people in a coherent way. And then when you go meet them to chat about those things as well. And then that follows on to the publishing route as well. So the editor has some confidence, like, okay, well, other things in this ballpark have sold. I can see conceivably where this might be.
And was that your first step, finding an agent to take you on?
Yeah. So I've had fun interactions with agents down the years.
Yeah.
I had an agent for another novel that went out to editors but didn't sell, and then the agent ghosted me, which was an interesting experience. So I had to find a new agent as well. So yeah, I think it always comes back to that thing of knowing where you fit in, but also finding good relationships with people.
Yeah.
Where it's working for both of you. I think was really important for me as well.
And you were going through so much of this process during a pandemic, which must have complicated things, made them more difficult, I don't doubt, in many ways. Did it open any doors?
It gave me a bit more time. My first phase, so the book was contracted before the pandemic started.
Yeah.
And then the first few weeks, I mean, everything was terrible. It was like a hell in a handbasket stage. And I thought, oh God, I'm going to get an email in a few weeks saying, Danny, this book's a bit bleak. We can't publish it. Or you could change it and make it happy.
Yeah.
It is kind of happy. I'll take that back.
Yeah.
So that was my first favourite. But yeah, I think what's been quite interesting about it is the way that it's sort of it's lengthened the process. It's given me a lot more time to write, and it gave me a lot more time to finesse the book, which I think actually worked out really well for that. So it was delayed. It was delayed in publications. It was supposed to come out last summer, and then it was delayed until the start of the year, and then it was delayed again because they were waiting for bookshops to open, because bookshops are integral to the debut novels because they don't really crop up on Amazon and things like that. Yeah, so I think the extra length that came in that, and the distance just to be able to sit back and reflect on it. So I think that intervention of time and distance makes such a difference to the way that you conceive of a book and the way that you think about it and the way that you feel about it. And you see so much that you just don't see in the heat of writing it.
Yeah, that word distance, I think it's really interesting there. The book goes through those processes, editing, publication, and then promotion, how you get the word out, all of that going on. You think that distancing, is a really necessary component of your relationship with the first book?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you also have to be able, I mean, distance in the sense of that, so through, as I was saying, through time, you get a better sense of what it is and how you might do it. Distance in the sense that you're allowing other people to turn up and go, actually, no, this bit is horrendous, do something different.
Yeah.
And sometimes it works in the opposite direction. They'll point out something that they think is really good, and you thought, oh, I'd never noticed I did that. Or I can't remember doing that, which is often a trickier one.
Yes.
And that's like a positive reinforcement, which is quite nice as well. But distance, I mean, I think it really helps to have some emotional distance from the thing in itself as well, because you do have to leave it behind.
Yeah.
Like you have to move on at some point. I remember when they sent me the copies, when they sent me the finished copies, it was a box full of copies of the book, and I remember getting it out and thinking, oh my God, it's trapped. Like I can't do anything else with it now. It's stuck there. And I think at that point I was like, oh yeah, well, I can leave that now. Yeah. And I think that distance and some of the things that you learn from that distance and hopefully that reflection on what you've done means that the next thing you do is better, and the next thing you do, you learn some of those things.
Yeah, and indeed you have moved on. The next thing.
Yeah.
You are currently in the process of writing novel number 2, which I imagine is just as challenging, if not more so, than the first book. And it is a book that thinks about Middlesbrough and thinks about family and thinks about memory, and there may very well be links between what you did in Nothing and what you're doing now, but you will be, I've no doubt, moving in different ways. So that process of learning that you've described, do you find that is smoothing the path, or do you find that actually all sorts of new boulders come up?
I suppose in one sense it smooths the path, in that you've learned how to do things by virtue of producing one book, or many in some cases. I suppose where that throws up new obstacles is that those things that you've learned to do quite easily, you kind of get bored of doing. So well, it means you have to do something else that's probably harder still, because you would have done it if it was easy in the first place. I mean, in many ways, the book that I'm doing writing now isn't a matter of distance at all. I've gone back to something that I've been doing for years. So I started this book, oh God, it must have been like 2010, 2011, something like that. Yeah. And then abandoned it because it was insane. And no one wants a book about Middlesbrough anyway, at the best of times. So I think what I've sensed here is an opportunity. I've opened the door a little bit. So I'm going to say, well, here's my chance to do something really off the wall. And if it doesn't work, then fine, I'll go back and do whatever is sensible. But yeah, I think that's what's exciting about it, though, isn't it? That sense of, well, it wouldn't have been easy to do something that's the same as Nothing, would it be? conceivably you could, but
Very
I
difficult.
think,
Yeah.
I think do something different. That's
Yeah.
what's exciting about it, and that's what's interesting about it.
Yeah.
So I've set myself a ludicrous challenge of writing a book that makes no sense, that will interest nobody.
I'm sure that's not true.
Well, it's basically like a 100,000 word in-joke for me. And it's probably going to ruin my career as well, Dinah. So this,
Right,
yeah.
okay. Well, I don't often contradict my interviewees, but I will say I am perfectly certain that it will interest us.
Yeah.
So at this point, I'm going to hand over to you, to the audience. I'm sure you have questions. So just lift your hand and wait for the microphone before you ask your question, and Daniel will respond. So, any questions then for Daniel? Yes, and here comes the mic.
Hi, really interesting reading and conversation as well. A couple of things. How did you mentioned about it became a book about marriage? How has your kind of your thoughts on marriage changed from before writing it to now? Question one, and possibly choose to answer these or not, as you will. When did the title come? And could it have been called something?
My wife's sitting in the front row here, so I'm going to be really careful. I think I already had positive attitudes towards marriage, and it's only reinforced them that it's even better. No, I think I think one of the things about that, I suppose, it pushed me to think about all of the ways in which you are interconnected. That I suppose, like, it's those things that you are kind of you dimly aware of, but it forced into the forefront of my mind. That sense that actually your attachments to this person run deeper than just the sort of coincidence of you living your lives together and doing particular things together. You create each other in many ways, and you exist in each other's minds, and I think that's such a lovely thing. So, and the answer to your second question actually is also again my wife. I went through some really terrible titles for this. At one point, I wanted to steal a line from King Lear. Never, 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 never. Was that enough? Was that 5? It should have been 5. The 5 nevers from King Lear, which is my favourite line of any Shakespeare, because it takes some brass neck, that, doesn't it? It was called Nothing Solid for a bit, as in sort of everything melts into air. And then we were having a chat about it. We were just having a chat one day about what the hell am I going to call this book? Like, it's being picked up. My editor was like, "Oh, I quite like Nothing as a title," but she was maybe leaning towards something more lyrical. She didn't have anything in mind. She was like, "Just do something better than you've given me already," which is always good editorial advice.
Yeah.
And we were just having a chat about it, and my wife was like, "No, you should call it Nothing." I think she was right. I really like it. Because it has. There's something quite Beckettian about that, which I quite like. That sense of just a one-word title. It's obviously a very Beckettian word. And also, why Nothing rather than Something? I suppose just because, he doesn't bring things into being. He sort of erases things. So it necessarily points towards nothing. It points towards the challenge of things vanishing or erasing. So that was why I settled on Nothing. I think Nothing's a better title than Something as well.
Yes.
People have lower expectations with Nothing. Yeah, I've made so many bad puns. It's kept me going for months just doing that. Yeah.
I think it's a great title. Yeah.
Thank my wife.
Further questions? Yes. And here comes the mic at top speed.
Being a Northerner yourself, I wonder if you could talk more about the choice to set the novel in the South and how that compares to the experience of writing a novel in the North now.
Yeah, really cynical in many ways. I was living in the south at the time, so I started it when I lived in London, and then finished it when I was living in St Albans, which is a commuter belt. So the commuter belt thing influenced it a lot because there's a lot of that sort of edgeland material in the book, so it fed its way into there. But as I was saying earlier, when Dinah had asked about that distance, I said, well, okay, well, I've gone back to a book about the north. So I finished a version of this book that I'm working on now. There's a very different version of it, but I finished it maybe like 7 or 8 years ago. And I think the reaction to it was really interesting. I'm conscious that it was a really odd book and it had massive faults with it. But the reaction to it was always a little bit of a sense of, maybe it's just too alien. Like it's too